The sun had just begun its slow descent beyond the horizon, painting the wide Texas sky in streaks of amber and rose. The wind carried the scent of dust and dry sage, whispering across the barren plains. A lone cowboy rode through the emptiness, his silhouette etched against the fading light. His name was Caleb Holt, a man of few words and many scars, both on his skin and his soul. Caleb had spent years drifting from one ranch job to another, never staying long enough for people to remember his face. He'd seen too much of life's cruelty to believe in luck or mercy. Yet that evening, as his horse trudged beside a narrow stream cutting through the valley, fate placed something in his path that would change everything. At first, he thought it was an animal, perhaps a wounded coyote lying by the riverbank. But as he drew closer, his heart gave a sharp jolt. It was a young woman. She lay half in the water, her skin pale against the mud, her dress torn to shreds as if she'd been dragged through thorns or worse. Dried blood streaked her arm. Her hair, dark and tangled, floated gently in the current. Caleb's instincts screamed at him to be cautious. Outlaws sometimes use such sights as bait to lure riders off their trails. Yet there was something helpless, something haunting, about the way she lay there, the faint rise and fall of her chest betraying that she was still alive. The cowboy dismounted and knelt beside her, his shadow falling over her like a silent guardian. The girl's body was cold, her pulse weak but steady. Her lips moved faintly, as if caught in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Around her wrist, Caleb noticed a strip of rope, freshly frayed, as though someone had bound her not long ago. He looked around. The river valley was quiet, but the kind of quiet that carried a warning. A set of boot prints led away from the bank, fading into the dry brush. Whoever had left her there couldn't have gone far. Caleb knew he had two choices: ride away and pretend he'd never seen her, or risk everything to help. The law in these parts was fragile, and men didn't take kindly to meddling in others' business. But something deep within him refused to leave her. Maybe it was the ghost of the sister he'd lost years ago. Maybe it was just his worn-out conscience stirring, for the first time in a long while. He lifted the girl gently into his arms. She was light, fragile as a bird, her breath shallow against his chest. He could see bruises on her shoulders, marks of rough hands. Whatever had happened, it wasn't an accident. By the time Caleb reached his small cabin on the ridge, the light had faded completely. The place wasn't much, just a wooden shack and a corral for his horse. But it was safe and hidden from the road. He laid the girl on his cot, lit the oil lamp, and fetched a bowl of water. Her wounds were old enough to clot but still raw. Whoever had done this had meant for her to die alone. As the wind howled outside and night settled heavy over the plains, Caleb tended to her silently, cleaning each cut, wrapping her arm in a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. The more he looked at her, the more questions stirred in his mind. She didn't look like a drifter or a ranch hand. Her hands were soft, her features delicate, like someone who had known comfort once. Hours passed before her breathing steadied. He sat nearby, the lamp's glow flickering across his weathered face. Outside, a coyote cried, a lonely, mournful sound. Caleb leaned back in his chair, one hand resting on the revolver by his side. Something told him this wasn't over. Whoever had left her for dead might come looking. And if they did, he'd be ready. Far out across the valley, a faint light flickered in the darkness. Maybe a campfire. Caleb's jaw tightened. He had no way of knowing whether it belonged to travelers or the devils who had hurt the girl. Now sleeping in his bed, he stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to the creaks of the cabin, the wind pressing against the walls. Every sound set his nerves on edge. But as dawn began to creep through the cracks of the shutters, he felt something stir inside him, a feeling he hadn't known in years. Hope. The girl was alive, and that meant something. Maybe it meant redemption. Maybe it meant trouble. Either way, Caleb Holt knew there was no turning back. As the first light touched her face, She stirred for the first time, a faint whimper breaking the silence. Caleb rose, watching closely. The nightmare wasn't over, not yet, but he'd made himself a silent promise. Whoever had done this would answer for it. And he would protect her, no matter the cost. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying distant hoofbeats across the plain. Caleb's eyes narrowed. Someone was coming. The morning broke cold and gray over the valley, a mist rising from the river that snaked through the land like a pale ghost. Inside the cabin, the air hung still, carrying only the faint crackle of dying embers. Caleb Holt stood by the window, his rifle propped beside him, eyes fixed on the ridge beyond the creek. He had heard them in the night. Hoofbeats, distant yet deliberate. Whoever was out there hadn't come to pass through. They had been searching. The girl still lay on the cot, her face soft beneath the morning light. The bruises on her neck had begun to fade from dark violet to dull yellow, and her breathing had steadied. She looked peaceful now. But the remnants of her terror lingered in the tightness of her hands, the way her fingers curled into the blanket, as if holding on to life itself. Caleb knew that whatever storm had brought her here hadn't passed. It was only circling, waiting for the right time to strike again. He stepped outside, the chill biting at his skin. The plains stretched out endlessly, a world painted in shades of dust and silence. His horse grazed nearby, restless. He crouched beside the trail leading away from the cabin and studied the dirt. Fresh prints. 4 riders, maybe 5. Heavy boots. They'd passed through only hours ago. He followed the trail a short distance down the slope, before it split. One set veering toward the old mining road, the other cutting across the river. Caleb's gut told him the men who'd hurt the girl weren't wandering aimlessly. They were circling back. When he returned to the cabin, the girl had shifted, her brow creased as if her dreams tormented her. Sweat glistened on her skin, her lips moving faintly. He fetched a damp cloth and wiped her forehead, but his mind was elsewhere. He'd lived long enough to recognize the look of hunted souls. Whoever she was, she hadn't stumbled into trouble, she'd escaped it. The hours crawled by. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of distant rain. Caleb busied himself preparing, checking the rifle, securing his horse, packing what little food he had left. Every so often, he glanced at the girl. Her presence in his cabin had changed something in him. For years, he'd lived like a ghost, surviving but not living, drifting but never belonging. Now, for the first time in a long while, there was purpose in his every move. As the sun began to sink again, painting long shadows over the land, the girl stirred fully. Her eyes fluttered open, dazed and frightened. Caleb froze where he stood. She tried to move, but her body failed her. Panic rippled through her like a wave. He kept his distance, knowing any sudden movement would only worsen her fear. Her gaze darted around the room. The wooden walls, the flickering lamp, the stranger standing a few paces away. Then she slumped back, too weak to do more than breathe. Caleb turned away, giving her space, though his mind raced. She'd seen him now. The man who'd found her half dead by the river. But he didn't need thanks. He just needed to keep her alive. Outside, thunder rolled low and heavy, echoing across the valley. Caleb could feel the weight of the coming storm. Not just the rain, but the danger it carried. Somewhere out there, men were closing in. By nightfall, the rain began to fall in sheets, pelting against the cabin roof like the beat of war drums. Lightning flashed, and for an instant, Caleb saw the dark shapes of riders far in the distance. They were moving slowly, cautiously, their torches flickering like willow, the wisps in the gloom. His heart hardened. They were searching for her. He snuffed the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. The only sound was the rain and the girl's faint breathing. He crouched by the window, rifle in hand, watching the distant glow of the torches drift closer, then fade as the storm swallowed them whole. Hours passed. The rain softened, then ceased entirely. The plains fell silent once more. Caleb waited until he was certain they had moved on before lowering the rifle. But he knew this was just the beginning. At dawn, the sky cleared, and a faint mist clung to the earth. The girl slept again, exhausted by the storm and her wounds. Caleb saddled his horse and scanned the horizon. He needed to move her. The cabin was no longer safe. He returned inside and looked down at her, the pale morning light tracing her features. There was a strength in her face that hadn't been there before, a quiet defiance beneath the wariness. Whatever had happened to her, she wasn't broken. Not yet. Caleb packed what little supplies he had left: water, dried meat, a small blanket. He wasn't sure where they'd go, only that staying meant death. By midday, the girl stirred again, weakly trying to rise. Caleb steadied her, careful not to startle her. She blinked up at him, confusion and exhaustion clouding her gaze. Her lips parted, but no words came. Only a soft breath, a ghost of sound swallowed by the wind. Caleb helped her sit up, then wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. She trembled, clutching it tight, her eyes darting toward the door, as if she feared what might be waiting beyond it. He looked outside once more. The plains stretched endlessly, but far off, a plume of dust rose into the air. Riders again, and closer this time. The decision was made. There was no time left. He lifted the girl gently, cradling her against his chest as he stepped outside. His horse whinnied, sensing the urgency. Caleb mounted with her in his arms, and with a sharp nudge, they galloped toward the canyon pass. A narrow trail that wound through the cliffs, known only to a few. Behind them, the dusk grew thicker. The riders were coming fast. The wind tore at Caleb's hat, the thunder of hooves echoing off the rocks. The girl clung weakly to him, her eyes half closed, her breath shallow. But he could feel the faint spark of life in her still, and that was enough. As they disappeared into the canyons, the horizon behind them filled with shadows. The hunt had begun. And from that moment, Caleb Holt's life would never again belong to him alone. The canyon walls rose like jagged teeth around them, cutting through the pale sky as Caleb urged his horse forward. The animal's hooves struck the dry stone with sharp, echoing cracks that bounced off the cliffs. Behind them, the sound of pursuit rolled like thunder, distant but closing. The men who had hurt the girl were not giving up. The girl lay slumped against Caleb's chest, her body weak and trembling with exhaustion. The ride through the narrow canyon was punishing, each turn a battle against the unforgiving terrain. Loose gravel slipped beneath the horse's hooves, and the wind whipped through the pass like a knife. Caleb's eyes darted between the winding trail ahead and the jagged shadows behind, knowing that one mistake could end them both. As they climbed higher, the canyon narrowed to a twisting gorge where sunlight barely reached. The air grew cool and heavy, carrying the faint scent of rain. Caleb guided the horse carefully through the rocks, every sense alert. He could feel the girl's shallow breath against him. Faint, but still there. That fragile rhythm was the only thing keeping him moving. By midday, they reached a small plateau overlooking the valley. Caleb halted the horse, letting it breathe while he scanned the horizon. Below, faint specks of dust moved along the riverbed, riders searching, spreading out in a wide arc. They were organized, methodical, and patient. Whoever commanded them was no fool. Caleb's mind turned over the possibilities. He didn't know who the girl was, or what she had done to earn such relentless pursuit. But he could sense it. The kind of danger that didn't fade with distance. He dismounted and laid her gently against a boulder, shielding her from the harsh wind. Her face was pale, her lips cracked, but her eyes fluttered faintly beneath closed lids. She was fighting to live, though her strength was nearly gone. He poured a few drops of water between her lips, watching as her throat moved weakly to swallow. The silence of the canyon pressed in around him, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling high above. Caleb knew they couldn't stay long. He needed to find shelter, a place where they could disappear, even for a few hours. A faint memory stirred in his mind, an old prospector's cave, hidden deep in the southern ridge. It had been years since he'd last seen it, but it was their only chance. With the last of his strength, Caleb lifted the girl back into the saddle and turned the horse toward the ridge. The trail grew steeper, cutting across narrow ledges where one misstep could send them tumbling into the ravine below. But Caleb pressed on, his focus unshaken. As the sun began to sink behind the canyon walls, they reached a narrow cleft in the rock, barely wide enough for a man to pass through. Beyond it lay a hollow, sheltered from sight, where the old cave opened like a dark mouth against the stone. He led the horse inside, then carried the girl into the shadows. The cave was small but dry, the air cool and still. Caleb laid her down on a patch of old hay left behind by travelers long gone. He started a small fire with the last of his matches, its glow painting the rough walls in flickering gold. For the first time since dawn, he allowed himself to breathe. Outside, the wind howled through the canyons, masking the sounds of their pursuers. Caleb tended to the girl's wounds again, washing the dirt from her skin, rewrapping her bandages. Her arm was swollen, the bruises along her ribs darker now. But her pulse was stronger. She was surviving, barely, but enough to keep hope alive. As the fire crackled, Caleb studied her face. There was something refined in her features. A hint of grace that didn't belong to the dust and grit of frontier life. She was not a saloon girl, or a drifter. She looked like someone who had known another world. Perhaps the daughter of a ranch owner, or maybe someone tied to money and power. Whatever her story was, it had led her into the hands of cruel men. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly across the plains. The storm was returning. As night deepened, Caleb sat near the fire, his rifle resting across his knees. The shadows shifted along the cave walls, dancing like restless spirits. His mind wandered to the men who chased them, the riders who had moved with such precision, who had hunted with such intent. They weren't simple bandits. No. These were hired guns professionals. That meant someone had paid dearly to find the girl. The thought settled heavy in his chest. If someone wanted her dead, then keeping her alive would come at a price, one that could end his own life. But even knowing that, he felt no hesitation. Somewhere deep inside, the part of him that had long gone numb was beginning to stir again. The girl murmured softly in her sleep, her brow furrowing as if she were reliving her pain. Caleb watched her for a long time, the firelight flickering across her face. There was something in her expression, a strength hidden beneath the fear. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering softly at the cave's mouth. The sound was strangely soothing, like a lullaby for two lost souls hiding from the world. Caleb leaned back against the cold stone, exhaustion pulling at his eyes. But just as he began to drift into uneasy rest, a faint sound reached his ears. The low, deliberate crack of distant hooves. He froze. They had found the trail again. The rain grew heavier. But through the rhythmic patter came another sound. The muffled jingle of bridles, the muted murmur of voices carried by the wind. The riders had entered the canyon. Caleb's heart pounded steady and cold. He doused the fire with his boot, plunging the cave into darkness. The faint glow vanished, replaced by the silence of rain and thunder. He could see nothing now, but he didn't need to. He knew the rhythm of pursuit, the way men moved when they were hunting. The girl stirred faintly, her lips parting in a weak breath, unaware of the danger outside. Caleb pressed a hand to his revolver, his mind sharp and clear. He would not let them take her. Not tonight. Not ever. The hoofbeats grew louder for a moment, then began to fade again, lost in the rumble of the storm. The men were moving past the ridge, perhaps deceived by the rain. Caleb waited in silence, every muscle tense, until the last echo vanished into the distance. Only then did he allow himself to exhale. The danger had passed, for now, but he knew it would return, fiercer than before. And when it did, he would be ready. As dawn crept through the canyon once more, Caleb stood at the cave's entrance, watching the gray light wash over the endless expanse of stone and sky. The storm had left the world quiet, but beneath that calm lay the promise of more violence to come. Behind him, the girl slept soundly for the first time, her face peaceful in the pale light. Caleb turned his gaze toward the horizon, his mind heavy with unspoken resolve. The chase was far from over, and in the days to come, he would uncover the truth of who she was, and why men were willing to kill for her. The morning light crept softly into the cave, chasing away the shadows that had lingered through the storm. The air was still damp, heavy with the scent of wet earth and smoke from the fire Caleb had doused the night before. The rain had washed the canyon clean, leaving the world glistening in pale hues of gold and gray. Caleb stirred from his place near the entrance, his rifle resting across his knees. He had not truly slept. His eyes were sunken from the long night, his body stiff from the cold stone floor. But he was alive, and so was she. The girl he had risked everything to save. Inside the cave, she lay beneath the thin blanket, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Her color had returned, faint warmth seeping back into her cheeks. The worst of the fever had broken sometime before dawn. Caleb studied her in silence, the firelight of early morning painting her face in soft tones. There was something haunting about her. Not just her beauty, but the mystery that clung to her like a second skin. He could see the faint marks on her wrists, the bruises around her neck, and the scratches that told the story of her escape. She had run far, and whoever had hunted her had done so with ruthless intent. Caleb didn't need to know her name to understand that danger followed her still. As the hours passed, she began to stir, her lashes fluttering against her pale skin. Her eyes opened slowly, revealing a shade of deep green that caught the light like polished glass. For a moment, she stared blankly at the cave ceiling, disoriented and fragile. Then awareness dawned. Confusion, fear, and something deeper. Caleb remained motionless, watching her struggle to piece together where she was and how she had survived. Her gaze fell on him briefly, and though no words were spoken, the silence between them seemed to say everything. She did not cry out, nor did she shrink back. Instead, she looked away, as if shame and memory had bound her tongue. He turned from her, giving her space. The fire crackled faintly as he added a few small branches, careful to keep the smoke thin. He could feel her eyes on him again, filled with unspoken questions he could not answer. The wind outside had calmed, but the world beyond the canyon walls remained dangerous. Caleb knew they could not stay long. The men who hunted her were patient. Too patient to have given up after one night of rain. They would regroup, track the trail again, and come for her. And when they did, they would kill anyone who stood in their way. By midday, the sun burned high above the ridges, flooding the canyon with harsh light. The girl had managed to sit up, her movements slow and pained but determined. She pulled the blanket closer around her shoulders, her torn clothes beneath it, a reminder of what she had endured. The wind caught her hair, lifting the tangled strands around her face. Caleb watched her from the entrance, silent and alert. He had questions, more than he could count. But he knew better than to seek answers yet. He could tell by the distant look in her eyes that she was trapped between the past and the present, haunted by things too heavy for words. Still, her presence was changing him. In her weakness, he saw a strength that stirred something buried deep within his heart. A quiet, stubborn will to protect, to fight, to believe again in something beyond survival. As the afternoon waned, Caleb prepared for their next move. He saddled the horse, packed what supplies remained, and checked the ammunition in his revolver. Every action was deliberate, each motion heavy with unspoken resolve. The girl watched him with quiet curiosity. She still did not speak, but her eyes followed him, as if trying to understand the man who had saved her. The man who had given her a chance to live, when the rest of the world had tried to bury her. As the sun began to dip behind the western ridge, Caleb stepped outside one final time to scout the horizon. What he saw made his chest tighten. In the far distance, faint trails of dust rose again, thin, deliberate lines against the pale sky. Riders, moving with purpose, searching. The storm had not washed away their scent after all. Caleb returned to the cave, his expression carved from stone. He moved quickly now, dousing the embers of the fire, packing the last of the food, and tightening the horse's reins. The girl tried to stand, her legs trembling beneath her, but she steadied herself against the wall. Her determination surprised him. She was fragile, yes, but there was steel beneath her silence. He helped her onto the horse, and together they rode deeper into the labyrinth of canyons, where the rocks twisted and rose like walls of an ancient fortress. The trail was perilous, but it offered one advantage: cover. The sound of the horse's hooves echoed softly, blending with the sigh of the wind through the stone corridors. Caleb knew these lands well. The forgotten paths carved by miners decades ago, the hidden ridges where a man could vanish from sight. He guided them toward one such place, a narrow ravine where the cliffs formed a natural shelter. As dusk settled, they reached a high plateau overlooking the vast plains. The world below stretched endless and golden beneath the dying light. The girl gazed out at it, her eyes reflecting both wonder and sorrow. It was the first time she had seemed awake, alive to the world around her. For a fleeting moment, the silence between them felt almost peaceful. The chase had slowed, the air had softened, and in that fragile calm, it seemed as though the world had paused, holding its breath for whatever would come next. But peace was a rare visitor in the frontier. Far below, in the fading light, a flicker of fire appeared, then another, and another still. The riders had found their trail again. Caleb's jaw tightened. The hunt was closing in. He turned his gaze toward the girl. She stood unsteadily beside the horse, her blanket slipping from her shoulders. For the first time, he saw the full weight of her story in her eyes. Pain, loss, and the glimmer of a secret she had carried too long. Whatever truth she held, it was the reason men were willing to kill. And as the fires burned brighter in the valley below, Caleb knew that secret would soon come to light. He looked to the darkening sky, the last streaks of orange fading into night. The time for hiding was nearly over. Whatever waited ahead, betrayal, blood, or redemption, they would face it together. And as the first stars appeared over the desert, Caleb felt it deep in his bones: the real fight was only beginning. The night was deep and windless, the kind of stillness that came before bloodshed. The fires in the valley below burned like a ring of eyes, watching from the darkness. Caleb stood at the edge of the cliff, his silhouette sharp against the faint moonlight, every sense alive with tension. Somewhere down there, men were preparing to hunt again. He knew it as surely as he knew the sound of his own heartbeat. Behind him, the girl rested near the rocks, wrapped in her torn blanket. Her strength had begun to return, but her silence weighed heavy in the air. For days now, she had said nothing of her past. Not where she came from, not what had happened, not why the men refused to let her live. But as the fires glowed brighter, something in her began to break. The truth was coming, whether she wished it or not. Caleb turned from the cliff, his eyes finding hers. They were different now, not just frightened, but burdened. There was a story behind them, one written in pain and secrets. And it was that story, he knew, that had brought death to their trail. The girl shifted slightly, pulling the blanket tighter, as if it could hide her from the weight of the past. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from the memory of what she'd endured. Caleb could see it, the way her breath quickened whenever distant hoofbeats echoed through the night, the way her gaze darted toward every flicker of light beyond the canyon. She was haunted, not just by men, but by what they had done in her name. As dawn crept over the land, painting the horizon in dull gold, the first part of her truth revealed itself. Not through words, But through the signs Caleb began to piece together. Her torn dress had once been fine, the kind worn by the daughters of ranch barons or men of wealth. Her hands, though roughened by recent struggle, bore the traces of a life not built on labor. And around her neck, hidden beneath the edge of the blanket, Caleb noticed a thin silver chain, the kind engraved with family crests, not worn by the poor. He began to understand. She wasn't just a victim of random cruelty. She was running from power, from the kind of men who thought themselves untouchable. By midday, the riders below had begun to move again, their formation tightening, their direction unmistakable. They were coming up the ridge. Caleb prepared the horse, tightening the reins, his mind racing with options that grew fewer by the hour. The girl watched him with quiet dread, her lips pressed together, her body trembling not with weakness now, but with guilt. He could feel it radiating from her. The weight of something unspoken, the kind that could destroy a man just by knowing it. When the sun reached its peak, the silence between them finally cracked. The girl stood, her knees still unsteady, her eyes shining with the reflection of the bright, merciless sky. She didn't need to speak for Caleb to see what the truth was doing to her. The pain of it, the fear, the shame. In that moment, he knew. She was no outlaw, no fugitive by her own making. She was someone who had seen too much, someone who had witnessed something powerful men wanted erased. The realization hit him like a gunshot. She was the reason those riders were willing to cross every inch of this desert. She carried a secret worth killing for. Caleb's chest tightened with anger, but beneath that, something else stirred. A fierce, silent promise. He didn't need her to confess. The world had already told him what he needed to know. She was the hunted. And he, for better or worse, had become her shield. As evening fell, they rode again, deeper into the canyon's heart, where the air grew thin, and the rocks rose high like prison walls. The trail wound endlessly, and every shadow seemed to move. Caleb's instincts screamed that time was running out. The sky bled into crimson as the sun dipped low, and in that light, the world looked almost unreal, beautiful and cruel all at once. The girl leaned weakly against him, her breath shallow but steady. Her exhaustion was heavy, yet her will to live burned brighter with every mile. Behind them, faint but relentless, came the sound of pursuit. The riders were closing in. The echo of hooves grew sharper, carrying through the canyon like the beat of war drums. Caleb urged the horse forward, the animal straining beneath the weight of two lives and the burden of survival. Dust rose behind them, curling into the air like ghosts. The path ahead split in two, one leading toward the open plains, the other into the shadow of the cliffs. Caleb knew the open road meant death. The cliffs, though treacherous, offered cover. He chose the darkness. They rode hard until the moon climbed high above the jagged peaks. Then, at last, Caleb slowed the horse and dismounted near a dry stream. The girl slid weakly to the ground, her body trembling from exhaustion. He looked around. The silence here was thick, but not comforting. The stars burned bright overhead, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Caleb stood watch while she rested, his mind heavy with what lay ahead. He could feel it. The end was drawing near. Whether that end would bring life or death, he didn't know. But he understood one thing with brutal clarity. There was no turning back now. As the night deepened, the wind shifted again. The faint cry of an owl echoed through the cliffs. A warning carried by the wilderness itself. Caleb lifted his gaze toward the ridge. There, in the distance, faint against the starlit sky, he saw them, riders on the move. The gleam of metal caught the moonlight. They were close. Too close. He turned back toward the girl. She was awake now, sitting quietly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. And in those eyes he saw something new, not fear, but acceptance, the look of someone who knew that the truth she carried had finally caught up to her. Caleb's pulse steadied. He knew what came next. The running was over. Whatever those men wanted, Whatever secret had driven this long and merciless chase, it would end here, in the desert's cold embrace. As the riders began their slow ascent toward the canyon mouth, the air thickened with the scent of gunpowder and rain. The girl clutched the silver chain around her neck, her knuckles white. Caleb loaded his rifle, the metal clicking softly in the silence. And then, the first echo of hoofbeats reached them again, louder now, rolling like thunder through the stone corridors of the canyon. The storm was here. And Caleb Holt, the lone cowboy, who had once lived with nothing but ghosts, was about to fight for the one life that had given him a reason to stand again. The night burned with silence before the storm. The wind had stilled, the stars hung low and sharp above the canyon, and even the desert animals had gone quiet. Caleb Holt knew what that meant. The land itself was holding its breath. Death was near. He crouched beside the campfire, watching the embers die, their last light flickering against the hollowed faces of the rocks. His rifle lay across his knees, freshly loaded, steady in hands that no longer shook. Behind him, the girl sat against a stone wall, the faint moonlight softening her tired features. She had not slept. She couldn't. The truth she carried had finally come to light. And with it came the reckoning she could no longer outrun. She had once been the daughter of a powerful rancher, a man whose empire stretched across the southern plains. But her father's wealth had been built on blood and betrayal. When she uncovered proof of what he and his partners had done, the theft, the murder, the ruin of countless lives, she had tried to flee, carrying with her a single piece of evidence that could destroy them all. That was when they came for her. Now, those same men, her father's men, were closing in once more, determined to erase the last witness to their crimes. Caleb listened to the faint echo of hoofbeats, rolling through the dark. It was a sound he'd heard too many times in his life. Men coming to kill. He had been the hunter once. Now he was the hunted. And for the first time, he didn't care. He glanced toward the girl. Her dress, though still torn and dust-stained, no longer looked like a mark of shame. It was a symbol of survival. Her eyes, once clouded by fear, now burned with quiet resolve. Whatever happened here, she was ready. The first shot came without warning. A spark in the dark, a whistle of death cutting through the air. The bullet struck the rock beside Caleb's head, shattering stone into dust. He rolled into cover, the rifle rising in his hands as instinct took over. The night exploded in chaos, muzzle flashes lighting the canyon walls, horses screaming, men shouting orders that dissolved into the wind. Caleb fired back, measured and calm. Every shot he took had purpose. He was a man who had lived by violence. But this fight was different. This wasn't about pride or vengeance. It was about protecting something pure in a world that had long since forgotten purity. The girl stayed low behind the rocks, clutching the silver chain around her neck. The one piece of her old life she still held on to. Within the small locket hanging from it was the paper that damned her father's empire. Proof written in his own hand. That was what they wanted. That was why Caleb could not fail. The gunfire echoed through the canyon for what felt like hours. Men fell on both sides, their bodies swallowed by the sand. Caleb moved like a ghost through the shadows, his coat torn, his face streaked with dust and blood. Every breath came with fire, every heartbeat with pain. But he kept moving. At last, silence fell again. Not peace, but the heavy quiet that follows destruction. Smoke hung in the air like fog. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic scent of blood. Caleb stepped into the open, his rifle hanging loose at his side. The moon revealed the aftermath. Bodies scattered, horses wandering without riders. But from the darkness ahead, one last figure emerged. It was her father's enforcer, the man who had led the hunt, the one Caleb had seen in the town days ago. A shadow of authority and cruelty. His hat was gone, his face bloodied, but his eyes were cold and steady. The two men faced each other across the dying embers of the campfire. There were no words. There didn't need to be. The world narrowed to the sound of a single click as both men drew their guns. The next moments were a blur. A flash, a crack of thunder, and the smell of smoke. Then silence again. When the dust settled, Caleb stood swaying, the revolver still in his hand, a dark stain spreading slowly across his side. The other man lay still in the dirt. It was over. But victory came at a price. The girl rushed to him, her trembling hands reaching for the wound. But Caleb only shook his head faintly. He knew his time was short. The desert was claiming him, just as it had claimed so many before. He turned his gaze toward the horizon. The first pale light of dawn breaking across the cliffs. For a moment, the world seemed peaceful. The war was done. The girl knelt beside him, tears falling silently onto his weathered hands. Caleb's breathing slowed, his body weakening, but his eyes held the faintest trace of a smile. For once, he had done something that mattered. For once, he had saved a life instead of taking one. He reached out weakly, his hand brushing against the silver chain at her neck. The metal was warm against his skin. He nodded, as if to tell her what she already knew. To keep going, to live. To tell the truth that so many had died to bury. The wind picked up again, whispering through the canyon. It carried the sound of life returning. The cry of an eagle overhead, the rustle of dry grass. The world moved on. When the sun finally rose, the girl buried him beneath the red stone ridge overlooking the valley. She marked the grave with a simple wooden cross made from his rifle stock, the only thing he had left. Then she mounted his horse, the same horse that had carried them through fire and storm, and rode toward the distant horizon. She didn't look back. Behind her, the canyon remained silent, but somewhere in that silence lingered the memory of the man who had found her broken and bleeding in the dirt, and had chosen, against all reason, to save her. As the dust rose in her wake, the legend of Caleb Holt was born, whispered in saloons, carried on the wind, told by men who swore they saw him ride through ghost towns at dusk, watching over the lost and the hunted. And though the desert eventually erased his footprints, his story lived on. Not in books, not in songs, but in the quiet hearts of those who still believed that even in the cruelest corners of the Wild West, mercy could be stronger than hate. The girl rode on, her silhouette shrinking against the endless plains. Ahead lay justice, and behind her, the man who had given everything to make sure she reached it. The sun climbed higher, the land bathed in gold, and with each step of the horse, the past faded a little more, leaving only the memory of a cowboy who risked everything for a wounded girl in ripped clothes, and the redemption he found in her survival.